can China be mediator for peace in the Ukraine?
It's very unlikely that China can actually play a constructive role in mediating in the war in Ukraine at the moment. It has a decidedly pro-Russian position. It has strengthened over the last 12 months its closeness to Moscow. It has strengthened its partnership with Putin. Therefore, it is not being seen currently as a reliable partner for anyone on the other side of this conflict. And I think the problems in setting up a phone call between Zelensky and Xi Jinping are already pretty demonstrative of what the problem is at stake at the moment, that the Chinese side doesn't really have anything to offer to Ukraine at the moment.
But what is the reason that China is sort of trying to engage now, all of a sudden?
I think this is more the simulation of engagement in a way. It's not real engagement. It is something that plays incredibly well with the countries of the so-called global south. It is something that is important to make as an offer, to at least simulate that, to keep the illusion up that there is something being done on the Chinese side for the European partners, and it works. As we're seeing in the visits in China this week, where obviously the conversation about China playing that role is already part of the solution of the problem for China, because you can't be just seen as on the Russian side. You have to have that sort of, you have to be sort of seen as balanced, or at least attempting to be neutral. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. So it's more the illusion of creating peace, the illusion of a mediation process that is currently the best bet for China to hedge its kind of its bets in the war in Ukraine.
But what does that mean for the West then?
For the West, I think it means to be very, very clear-eyed and open and very pragmatic about what is possible. There are things that China, by not doing them, can actually do to make it less, make it a bit harder for Putin to maintain its war effort. So having a very close eye on dual-use export, having a very close eye on other goods that are being transported from China to Russia, that are being exported from China to Russia, that have a decisive impact on the war effort, from body armor to heavy vehicles. And then the question of where are the red lines for the Europeans? How can they demonstrate that everything that has to do with providing ammunition, drones, etc., of that sort would actually cross a red line for Europe and would lead Europe to strong reactions? I think this is something where Europe can signal something a lot stronger than it does at the moment.
But should the US and the NATO countries, should they try to negotiate with Beijing?
No, I don't think this is a negotiation with Beijing at the moment when it comes to a war in Europe. I think it is a signaling question for the Europeans and for the Americans to say, these are our red lines. You are, with the statements, Beijing, that you've made in saying, you are against NATO expansionism, etc. You have made yourself party to a conflict, and now we will have conversations with you, but this is not a separate negotiation track. The real negotiation needs to take place between Ukraine and between Russia, and whatever can be done to support that to actually be real negotiations and not enforced ones, I think is what Europe can do.
The new Russia-China cooperation, it seems like it's a new phase of Chinese policy, is that right?
Well, to be honest, I do not see any new China's policy towards Russia and Ukraine. I think that, of course, there was the Xi Jinping's visit to Russia, to Moscow, to meet with Putin. And I think that what Xi Jinping told Putin and what we see in the Chinese readouts is almost the same. Mm-hmm. So I do not see any specific change. I think there is a constant China's endorsement of Russia. So in that sense, there is no any change. Something which is which we know that China published 24th of February this year about this position paper in China's solution of Ukrainian crisis, which is very interesting. Also, not about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but Ukrainian crisis. These 12 points, it's nothing new. There is no any substantial change in China's position towards Russia, towards this invasion. So frankly, I do not see any change. Even if you ask me about change, maybe it's like a process of strengthening China-Russia cooperation.
But just looking back in the recent history, I mean, China and Russia, they were never really trusting each other. Does this change now?
Well, generally speaking, yeah, I agree with the history. And to be honest, when I think about China-Russia relations right now, there are many let's say, differences in a sense that, of course, there's a huge asymmetry between those two countries. And since Russia's invasion, we are seeing that this asymmetry is becoming bigger and bigger because China is the stronger partner, Russia is becoming as a junior partner. So in that sense, still there are many, I think, distrust between those two countries. But what is the glue that sticks together China and Russia? I think it's this kind of anti-Western sentiment, and it is very strong glue, even if there are some kind of differences in those two countries' perception, and as both China and Russia would be the number one in this official discourse, you know, number one in the world, of course. So there are, of course, different differences between those two countries, but this anti-Americanism or anti-Western approach is something which is very important for those two countries. And I think right now, when you see what is going on in China and in Russia, that those two countries are totalitarian countries, to be frank, not only authoritarian, is that the survival of their political regime is at stake. So this is the reason why they are cooperating with each other, because they are really afraid of losing power. Putin in Russia and Xi Jinping in China. And I think this is a very important issue, that even if we can see some differences, even there are probably some frictions between those two countries, that this meta goal that is anti-Western, anti-US is the very important, it is the reason why still those two countries are a very good friend, using this phrase from this last year joint statement, that this friendship has no limits.
So what you are saying, we are already in the middle of a Cold War. Russia, China on the one side against the Western countries.
Well, to be frank, I do not like this phrase, but to be frank, when I look what China is talking about the war in the last few months, I think that this is Chinese perception that there are blocks. Xi Jinping, but also Qin Gang during the latest NPC and this press conference on foreign policy, Chinese leaders are talking about blocks. You know, Cold War mentality is pretty obvious, it's not new, but they're talking about blocks. So I think that they are aware that is a kind of an anti-Russian / anti-China bloc because of this war in Ukraine. And on the other hand, is something like his bloc authoritarian to some extent. And what China would like to see is to expand its own, let's say, totalitarian or not democratic bloc, and to make smaller this anti-Russian or anti-Chinese bloc. So this is the reason why is it some kind of so-called charm offensive from Chinese side, or smile diplomacy that Xi Jinping started to present in G20 summit in Bali last year in November, because they would like to drive a wedge when it comes to the Western unity, just to divide, and try to maybe expand its own circle of friends. To be honest, Qin Gang is talking about circle of friends. So in that sense, they are aware there are some kind of blocks. Of course, it's difficult to say if it's 100% democracy versus autocracy. It's not the case. It's not very easy to have some to say what kind of how to call these blocks. But I think that China is starting to perceive the current world as having these two blocks.
But what does this mean for the European nations? Should we accept this? Should we be rushed into that two-block thinking, or?
Well, I think that for us the most important thing is to stay united, because
also with the US.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm talking about this democratic bloc, let's put it in this way. That's transatlantic unity, cooperation, and our cooperation with the so-called like-minded partners, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Australia, because this is very important, because what China is trying to do is to divide us. So, and of course, I know that it's better not to have blocs, but to cooperate with each other. But, you know, right now we could not change anything, China's behavior, I think. There are so many attempts, there were so many attempts to convince China to change, to condemn Russia, to support Ukraine. You know, it's very interesting that neither China has condemned Russia, but nor endorsed Ukraine in an explicit way for its fight for the democracy. Sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. So I think that the most important issue is to stay united.
Will the UN Security Council lose political impact with Chinese-Russian rapprochement? What impact will this have, that China and Russia became so close?
Well, it's a huge question because, you know, both China and Russia are permanent members of the Security Council. And, you know, what China would like to change, talking about this international order, it's really interesting that China is differentiating between rules-based international order, which is US-led, and this UN order. What China would like to reform is the UN order. It's obvious because China is a very important player in the UN, and together with Russia is in the Security Council. So this is the reason why I would like to not just to say that we have to get rid of this rules-based international order. But of course, it is extremely difficult to answer your question how to deal with this two authoritarian countries that are in the UN, and this very important, decisive body. I think that right now it is like, you know, this body does not work. Because if the aggressor is there, if China is there that supports Russia in my understanding is a very open manner. I do not agree with those voices that are talking that saying that China is neutral. It's not. China is pro-Russian. It's obvious. We can say that. It's China supports Russia. So I'm not sure if we could do something in the UN. Of course, in a General Assembly, probably. But you know, it's only like kind of statement without any specific actions that we could do.
It seems only after Putin's attack on the Ukraine that also the Eastern European countries changed their perception on China. I remember the 16+1 talks. And would you agree on this? Is this the only reason for the European countries to become much more skeptical?
Well, Central Europe is definitely more skeptical about China. It's even critical when it comes to China. And this Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a turning point. But it does not mean that my region changed perception of China because of Russia's invasion. We started to be more cautious about China, let's say in 2017, that we realized it's the same. I think it's exactly the same moment when EU as a whole started to rethink our EU's position towards China, because 2017, the beginning of the year, was this letter about sent by three countries, Germany, Italy, and France, to think about setting up the investment screening. So because we realized that China's pledges, economic pledges that offered to us in 2012, when this, as you said, the 16+1 formula was set up, there is no any benefits for us, for Central European countries. Then there was many other reasons why we started to be very cautious or even critical about China, the COVID. Also, you know, since COVID times, China started to approach to the EU with this disinformation. It was, for us, disinformation was mostly Russian. We know how to deal with this. But it was, China started to also use this information towards the region, towards the EU. Then, of course, the coercion against Lithuania. It was, I think, Lithuania case is China crossed the red line because they started to weaponize the interdependence, supply chains, and as you mentioned, this Russia's invasion is a turning point because we are aware of right now that we have because I'm from Poland, so we have a war, this classical kinetic war, not a kind of cyber war. And we have Russia is killing innocent people, children, they're bombing the hospitals and so on and so forth, and China endorses it. So, and to be frank, China is and was aware that we as a Central Europe are afraid of Russia, because being in the 16+1 format and meeting with Chinese officials also on the bilateral level, for sure in Polish case, we very often convey this message to China that we are afraid of strengthening China-Russia relations, because those relations, it's the fact that there's an alignment between China and Russia is nothing new, because it started a few years ago. So, and I remember 2017, there was military drills on the Baltic Sea, China-Russia military drills in Baltic Sea. You know, we were so astonished and so surprised. So China was aware, and China is aware that Central Europe is really afraid of Russia, plus China-Russia stronger, deeper cooperation. So I think it's pretty obvious that right now we are very critical and very cautious, and even hawkish sometimes when it comes to China and its support to Russia.